Hey everyone, another operant conditioning video, this time focused on what's going on in the brain. Again, just like with behavior, I'm going to try and focus on one of the trickier aspects that we need to talk about in this particular chapter. So I am going to assume that the information about which parts of the stimulus response outcome process are linked to different parts of the brain is pretty clear, right? Talks about it in the book. The slides walk through that as well, right? The dorsal striatum is involved in the learning that happens between the stimulus and the response, right? That behavior in response to a discriminating stimulus, and the orbital frontal cortex in our prefrontal cortex is responsible for predicting outcomes to certain behavior, right? So both of those parts of the brain are important in the overall stimulus response outcome relationship that's being developed in operant conditioning. So what's tricky, I think, about this part of the chapter is the difference between wanting something and liking something. And so you can see here the dopamine system, which might bring you back to intro neuro, right? We have two dopamine producing centers in the brainstem, one in the ventral tegmental area, or the VTA, that projects to frontal cortex, and one in the substantia nigra, part of it, the pars compacta, that projects to the dorsal striatum. So this should ring bells that dopamine is being sent to both parts of the brain that are involved in learning operant conditioning, right? So that's interesting, right? And we think of the VTA as one of the pleasure centers in the brain. It's one of the big areas for dopamine neuromodulation, right? One of those dopamine producing centers. And if we stimulate the VTA in animal studies, it has very powerful reinforcing properties, right? So this is some of the same system that's involved in addictions. So when we're talking about wanting versus liking something, behaviorally, we can define these very differently, right? So it seems like we have some brain systems that signal what we would call hedonic value, that is how good something is or how much we like it, versus different brain systems that seem to signal how much motivational value that we have. That is, how much are we willing to work to obtain a particular reinforcer if we're thinking about operant conditioning, right? So these seem to have separate brain areas that are involved in liking something versus wanting something. And it turns out in cases of addiction that as you become addicted to something and the dopamine system ramps up along with that, we seem to increase our want or our motivation to achieve that thing, but it doesn't necessarily increase in how much that we enjoy or like that thing. And that's really interesting in terms of thinking about treating addictions. So let's talk about dopamine and wanting, right? If we think about the substantia nigra pars compacta, it's part of the basal ganglia that contains dopamine producing neurons, like I mentioned, and they project to that dorsal striatum area. So there's a motor component there as well. One of the main hypotheses in this area is called the incentive salience hypothesis, which argues that dopamine motivates learners to work for reinforcement. So this is the underlying system that when we're learning something in an operant conditioning type of way, it's this part of the dopamine system that makes us want to achieve those reinforcers in our environment. So one of the studies that the book talks about, along with some data, has to do with rats that are either typical healthy control rats and rats who have dopamine antagonists given to them. So drugs that block their dopamine system, right? And so as from what we just talked about, you might even predict what would happen in those different rats in terms of their motivation to learn, right? What's important to know is that any rat given a choice between pressing a lever to get food that they like, they're going to do that versus just freely available food that they don't like as much, right? And so in general, if you offer rats sugar pellets versus kind of normal research rat chow, the rats are going to pick sugar pellets all the time. They're more tasty. They would prefer to eat those, right? And so if we compare the choice between working to press a lever and get sugar pellets versus eating freely available rat chow, if we compare those control rats to the ones who were given a dopamine agonist, you can see that those control rats are very happy to work to get those sugar pellets. They will press those levers, get those sugar pellets, much more than the rats given a dopamine antagonist. They're not really willing to work and press the lever to get that more desirable food. In fact, we see the opposite pattern if we look at how much of the freely available regular rat chow that's eaten in this case, right? Very little for the control group, right? They're spending much more time working to get those sugar pellets, right? Whereas the dopamine antagonist, they're just going to eat that food that's there. They're not motivated to work to get that tastier food of the sugar pellets, right? So blocking dopamine seems to block that motivation to work for something that we know is a good reinforcer. A second study done in monkeys also helps us think about how dopamine is involved here in terms of predicting reward. So in this study, Schultz trained monkeys to press a lever for food, much like the rat study that we just looked at. So all the data from these monkeys are after they're already trained to press a lever and they know that they're going to get a food reward. Here, instead of just looking at behavior, they're looking at electrophysiological recordings. So they're recording from neurons in the dopamine system, specifically in those midbrain areas. And what they find is that dopamine neurons in the monkey's midbrain seem to signal a reward or lack of a reward. So let's take a look at that a little more in depth. In this study, dopamine neurons in the midbrain seem to respond strongly when the monkey is given a reward when they weren't expecting one. They also seem to respond if a light occurs before the food and they've learned that this is a discriminating stimulus, and not, in fact, the activity actually goes down in dopamine neurons if they expect a reward and don't get it, right? And so this is all kind of in favor of that reward prediction hypothesis, that dopamine is involved in predicting future reward. So we have incentive salience hypothesis and reward prediction hypothesis. Dopamine seems to be involved in both of these things. And this is the actual data from that study, right? So again, all of these monkeys were trained and they know that if they press a lever, they're going to get a food reward. So this is the recordings from those neurons. So we have neurons firing on the y-axis and time on the x-axis. So this is an example in A of a trial where they don't press the lever, but then they're given a juice reward anyway. After that juice comes in, we see a big spike in dopamine activity, right? So they got a reward and they kind of pay attention to that, right? This trial is kind of a regular trial where the light comes on, they know that if they press the bar, they're going to get some food. And so we see that increase in dopamine signaling after the light comes on, really in response to that discriminating stimulus. So this dopamine signal is said to be predicting, right, that this food reward is going to come. And then when that reward actually comes, we don't see that spike, right, because this was expected, right? And so the dopamine signal is working here. C is an example of a trial where the animal is predicting a reward, but then they don't get one, right? So the light turns on, and so just like they did in B, right, those dopamine neurons are going to start firing because the animal is predicting that the reward is going to come when they press the lever, but then they're not given that reward. And then we actually see a dip in dopamine activity there, right? That their animal is aware that they didn't receive the outcome that they were expecting. So dopamine really does seem to be also telling us about whether or not we're expecting a reward based on the context that we're in, right? Remember that that discriminating stimulus gives us a context for whether certain behaviors should relate to certain outcomes. All right, so That's a little tricky, right? That's something to spend a little bit of time thinking about. And please do ask questions on the discussion board, right? I know that these are tricky concepts, right? Operant conditioning on its own might not be so bad, but as we link in those training schedules and what's going on in the brain, right, things get a little bit more complicated. So please use the discussion board for that. 3 of you did do the Socrative quiz, and all did pretty well. But if you had questions on any of the individual examples there, also please use the discussion board for that, right? The more that we use that discussion board, the more valuable it will be. Right now, it's kind of just me, and that's okay if you're feeling comfortable. But I know that there's probably questions, so please do ask. Stay well, and I'll talk to you again soon.